Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's live webcast, Engineering the Mechanical Properties of Amorphous Spray-Dried Dispersions. This is Rita Peters, Editorial Director of Pharmaceutical Technology. We're pleased to bring you this educational web-based event presented by Pharmaceutical Technology and sponsored by Capsugel Dosage Form Solutions, a global leader in delivering high-quality, innovative dosage forms and solutions to its customers in the healthcare industry. They utilize an array of proprietary technologies and specialized manufacturing capabilities to solve customers' most pressing product development challenges, including bioavailability-enhancement, modified release, bioformulation, and inhalation formulation. The company streamlines product development from pre-formulation through clinical and commercial supply for finished dosage forms. We have a few important announcements before we begin. This webcast is designed to be interactive, and we encourage you to ask questions during the event. You can submit your questions by typing them in the Q&A box, which can be found by clicking on the red Q&A widget at the bottom of the presentation window. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can following the presentation. You can enlarge the slide window by clicking on the small green icon at the upper right-hand corner of the slide window, or by hovering your mouse over the lower right-hand corner and dragging the window to the desired size. The slides will advance automatically during the event. If you have any technical problems viewing or hearing this presentation, please click on the question mark Help widget in the dock at the bottom of your presentation window. Now I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Aaron Goodwin, PhD, a principal investigator in the Research and Development Department at Ben Research, a division of Capsugel Dosage Form Solutions. His responsibilities include platform technology development for enhancement of oral bioavailability for small molecules. Now, I'd like to turn it over to you, Dr. Goodwin. Please get us started.
Well, thank you so much, Rita. So in this webinar, we're going to discuss how particle engineering by spray drying can be used to co-optimize several facets of SDD development with a specific focus on optimization of SDD mechanical properties. Specifically, we'll talk about how to reduce SDD tablet scale-up risks and ultimately decrease pill burden through the identification of the primary mechanism of SDD compaction. And finally, we will present some development case studies highlighting SDDs whose primary mechanism of compaction is plastic flow versus brittle fracture. So, I'm sorry. So the first thing I'd like to do is acknowledge a few people that contributed to this work. Specifically, I'd like to thank Randy Wald and Alyssa Ekdahl for their contributions. And of course, we would like to also thank Capsugel and Ben Research as well. So this slide shows some industry trends, and this is probably something that a lot of you have seen before. This is the DCS classification system, or Developability classification system. And really what we're looking at is on the x-axis solubility and the y-axis permeability. And there's a trend in the industry that a lot of new chemical entities fall in the DCS class 2 category of low bioavailability. Now this is subcategorized into solubility limited compounds and disso rate limited compounds. And the common thread is that these compounds need some sort of bioavailability enhancement technology in order to orally deliver a therapeutic dose. Now there's a lot of enabling technologies that address this issue. And, excuse me. And Capsugel has a breadth of technology platforms, one of which is bioavailability-enhancement. And there are several subcategories in bioavailability enhancements. One of the subcategories is spray-dried dispersions, or looking at an amorphous drug. So now what this slide shows is Capsugel, Bend Research's Bioavailability Enhancement Technology Applicability Map. Now this plot isn't exactly accurate, but it illustrates the way Bend Research approaches technology selection for bioavailability enhancement. And in reality, there's a large overlap in the technology approaches. Typically, it's a dimension that's not shown on this simple plot that further drives technology selection. There are a few examples being target PK profile, metabolism issues, permeation, and dose. However, one solution for bioavailability enhancement is to integrate the drug into an amorphous dispersion. Now, this is a non-equilibrium form of the material, has a higher free energy, and therefore higher solubility and dissolution rate. And this form of the drug can be stabilized thermodynamically or kinetically. One way to make this is using a spray-dried amorphous dispersion, or SDD. And in this process, the drug and the excipients, generally one being an amphiphilic polymer, are dissolved in a common solvent. The solution is then atomized into a stream of hot gas, evaporating the solvent off at a rapid rate, trapping the drug in an amorphous state within the glassy polymer. The resulting powder is comprised of a homogeneous dispersion readily integrated into an oral solid dosage form. And an example of what the particles look like is in the SEM micrograph on the right of the slide. So by manipulating the spray dry process, we can start to engineer these SDD particles. So this slide highlights some of the formulation and process variables that go into spray drying an amorphous dispersion. Although spray drying is a seemingly relative straightforward unit operation, there are many formulation and process degrees of freedom that impact the resulting material in different ways, and in addition have very complex interactions. SDD formulation and solvent type, although heavily influence downstream handling of the SDD powder and the mechanical properties, are generally selected based on dissolution performance and physical stability. And therefore, this talk is going to focus more on process handles as a way to engineer a particle's mechanical properties. So as we see on the upper right, the process parameters are further broken up into atomization and thermodynamics. And these are kind of the two orthogonal handles that we use when we engineer particles. So in the following slides, what we're going to show is how these parameters are characterized and how they relate to the resultant SDD properties, some of which are highlighted in blue on the lower right-hand side of the slide. And these are things like morphology, particle size, bulk density, and then bulk shear and Young's modulus. So the first thing we'll talk about is how do we characterize the thermodynamics and drying kinetics, and how do we optimize within a process space. So this slide shows an example of a thermodynamic operating space for spray drying SDDs. On the y-axis, we have a specific drying ratio, and that's the mass of solution divided by the mass of gas. And on the x-axis, we have the inlet temperature of the spray dryer. And the contour lines represent the outlet temperature at the spray dryer. So the space is constrained by several things. Really, material properties that are affected, and then the process. So the material properties are things like drugs and polymers' thermal degradation temperatures, and the resulting glass transition temperature of the dispersion, including the residual solvent based on the calculation of the relative saturation of solvent at the outlet of the spray dryer. The process is constrained by throughput on one end, and then what we like to call spray painting the dryer on the other end. That is, if you don't dry it fast enough, it all sticks to the sides of the spray dryer. Now within this space, we can start to engineer our particles. Okay, now this slide shows some different particles, how we can start to engineer the morphology and things like wall thickness of the particles. Now, there were a few videos in here, and unfortunately we had some technical issues, so I won't be able to play the videos. But what the video showed on the top was a slow-drying droplet on a stick. And the resulting morphology is particles that look dense like raisins. And the SEM micrograph on the right is a cross-section of one of those particles. And you can see it's generally looks like it's a collapsed sphere that kind of looks like a raisin, maybe has a little bit bigger wall thickness to it. And then the other side of that is fast drying, so that's on the bottom. And when we dry really fast, we get these very fluffy, hollow spheres, generally with a smaller wall thickness and lower residual solvent. And generally, these have the morphology of these can be seen on the right, the lower right, which is a hollow particle, spherical in nature, and with a lower wall thickness. So the other aspect of particle engineering is atomization. So the thermodynamics control the density and control the morphology, and atomization controls kind of the particle size and the distribution. So this slide shows some common atomization techniques used across all of spray drying application. We generally use pressure swirl and two fluid nozzles. And we use a phase Doppler particle analyzer to measure droplet size and velocity as a function of solution properties, nozzle type and geometry, and feed rate. What we then do is use a semi-empirical model to relate the droplet attributes to a particle size distribution of the dry powder. When we optimize the SDD particles, we essentially change the particle size and span through atomization and density and morphology through drying kinetics. So now that we have described the process handles we use to engineer the SDD particles, we'll take a step back and look at some of the other SDD attributes we have to be aware when we optimize the mechanical properties of the SDD. So as was said previously, SDD particle engineering is a multi-dimensional optimization problem. Traditionally, the drug substance and drug product are developed independently. But because we can dramatically change the drug product's attributes by spray dry particle engineering, we typically try and integrate the development of the drug intermediate and the drug product. And we generally categorize these attributes into absorption potential, physical state and chemical stability, mechanical properties and powder flow properties, and then spray dry throughput. Now, we further delineated these attributes into sensitive to formulation and sensitive to process conditions. Now, these estimates are based on averages of our previous experience, and this isn't always the case. But an interesting note, for mechanical properties, normally with crystalline mechanical properties, these are only sensitive to formulation and not process, i.e. we can change crystalline drug mechanical properties by changing polymorphs or salt forms, but generally not by changing what solvent we crystallize from. We have also assigned relative importance, suggesting although many of these attributes are co-optimized, there is a hierarchy. So in general, formulation is often set based on disintegration, dissolution, and physical and chemical state stability. And things like mechanical properties and powder flow are optimized within these constrained spaces. So in this talk, really what we're going to focus on is the mechanical properties as it relates to tableting. So if we take a step back, mechanical properties is the relationship between applied force and the resulting deformation, change in size or shape of the material. So this slide shows some common methods to downstream process SDDs into a tablet. Generally, we have two options. One option is to do a direct compression, so the SDD is blended with other excipients and then further blended with a lubricant, compressed and generally coated. The other option is a granulation option where the SDD is granulated. Dry granulation is something that we prefer in our experience. And this is because it attenuates any changes in SDD properties due to natural variation of the process and the raw materials. However, the process train that is selected generally depends on the density of the SDD and depends, of course, on the dose as well. Okay, so related to tableting, this slide has common development-related issues with associated risks for SDDs. And really these are based on our experiences. And one thing to note is the slide does not take into consideration powder flow, which can be an issue as well. But in general, SDDs are not as difficult to tablet as crystalline drug. Typical crystalline API properties that cause trouble are generally masked by the amorphous state of the drug and by the polymer. So one of the highest risks is tablet image. And the reason for this is because we dilute the drug in the intermediate, and then we further dilute it when we make the tablet. Two other risks are strain rate dependence of the material and tabletability. Although these risks are only low to medium in magnitude, they are related to the SDD's mechanical properties. So by gaining a really good understanding of the mechanical properties of the SDD, we can not only mitigate the two risks associated with the mechanical properties, we can also decrease the tablet image by optimizing SDD concentration in the tablet through rational excipient selection. So here's what I mean by that. This slide shows a typical IR tablet formulation that an SDD typical IR tablet formulation. And what we're trying to convey is that SDD particles can be engineered to have similar mechanical properties as common tablet fillers. So if we look in our typical IR tablet formulation, we see that the filler, the IR tablet is comprised of about 40 to 60% filler. And the filler, one reason the filler is added, there are multiple reasons, but one reason is to improve compact strength. And if we look at our table on the right here, we can see different common fillers compressed at 155 megapascal and the resulting tensile strength and solid fraction. So generally what we're seeing is that fillers have a tensile strength of about, for MCC, of course it's about 10, and then for lactose about 2 to 3, and starch and dical are a little lower. And the solid fractions are all generally about 85 or below. And for SDD, the range that we can achieve, the tensile strength range we can achieve is about 2 to 9 megapascal for about a 75 to 85% solid fraction. So SDDs can play a dual role as not only the active but also the filler if engineered correctly. So let's examine what happens to particles during a compression cycle to further investigate this. So this slide shows a single uniaxial compression cycle on a typical tablet press. So generally the powder enters in the die in a consolidated state between a bulk and tap density. As an initial stress is applied, there is a reduction in volume due to reversible particle rearrangement. As the stress increases, the volume further decreases due to irreversible deformation of the material. Now, particles can deform elastically, plastically, or they can fracture. For SDDs, this is dependent on the material. As particles deform, there is an increase in the proximity of particle surfaces forming bonds. So generally, the higher true areas of contact, the higher strength compact or tablet is made. So decompression is when the upper punch is removed and the compacted material relaxes in the axial direction. So then the tablet is ejected and the tablet may further recover in the axial and then in addition the radial directions as well. So specific to what we're going to be talking about in the rest of the talk, we're really focused on just the irreversible deformation aspect of this compression. Okay, so this slide shows some typical stress strain behaviors for common materials. And stress and strain are generally descriptors for applied force and deformation. So elastic, so when an applied force causes a deformation and then that material returns to its original shape, it's said to be elastic. Now, plastic deformation is when the material does not completely recover after removal of the stress, and the material deforms it deforms. And the yield strength is the force necessary to initiate this deformation. And then so contrary to plastic deformation, we have brittle materials which instead of yielding and plastically flowing, it fractures at its yield pressure, and this exposes new surface area. So this slide shows some cross-section, some SEM micrograph cross-sections of compacts with different SDD material. And depending on the formulation, the magnitude of these behaviors, the fracture, the plastic and elastic, can be engineered into the SDD particles. And so we can reduce scale-up risks and optimally reduce the tablet image by knowing the SDD mechanism of deformation and formulating the tablet around its strengths and weaknesses. So in the following slides, we'll show two case studies, one whose primary mechanism of deformation is brittle fracture, and the other plastic deformation. Okay, so case study one is an SDD that is mostly, primary mechanism of compaction is mostly brittle fracture. And so oftentimes a DOE is used to screen the sensitivity of spray dry factors to dissolution and downstream processability attributes. So the following is a DOE that was done with a compound that exhibits brittle fracture, but unfortunately some of the data had to be removed or cartooned because of legal. So regardless, in this case, as in most cases, a spray dry DOE is done post-formulation lock. So the focus really is on co-optimization of powder flow and downstream handling, mechanical properties. And so in addition, what we're really doing is looking for dissolution rate sensitivity at these different particle surface areas and morphologies. Now this DOE represents a general approach that investigates the impact of atomization and thermodynamics. And so we can see, if we look at the boxes, we investigated condenser temperature of the spray dryer, outlet temperature of the spray dryer, droplet size, which is atomization, and two other process parameters that weren't significant. So if we look at some of the results of this, the resulting SDDs, what we plotted here is bulk density and particle size. And there were 8 runs, but this is the cartoon just showing kind of the different morphologies we get, the different particles. And what we were able to achieve by changing those parameters in the spray dryer is we're able to get a particle size range, and this is based on a D43, between 10 micron and 90 micron. So that's a 9-fold difference in particle size just by changing our spray drying conditions. And the bulk density range was 0.08 grams per cc to about 0.42 grams per cc, which is a 5-fold difference. And looking at the surface area, this is about a difference of about an order of magnitude. And so the SEM micrographs on the right represent the particles, the native particles at the same magnification. So there's a pretty stark difference between, we can just see the difference in surface area between these two particles is pretty big. And so that we would expect that results in some pretty big differences during tableting and in its mechanical properties. Okay, so this slide shows CTC profiles of the resulting SDDs, and I think it's 7 of the 8. And so we generally use CTC profiles to aid in tablet formulation design and assess scale-up risks. So CTC profile, CTC stands for compressibility, tabletability, and compactability. Compressibility describes the volume reduction of a powder bed, in this case the SDD, in a confined space, in this case the die, caused by the application of force. This is generally similar for a given SDD formulation, but does not depend on particle surface area or morphology. So tabletability, which is the graph in the upper left, describes the ability of a compact to gain mechanical strength from bonding caused by the application of force. And finally, compactability is the intersection of these two. That is, it's the mechanical strength of a compact for a given porosity. So generally, when we tablet, we will try to target a 2 megapascal tensile strength, and what we try and do is stay below a 200 megapascal tensile stress. And in this example, the tablet was a direct compression. So really what we were concerned about is reducing the filler amount in the tablet and trying to do that with the lowest compression stress. And interesting enough, if we look at the tabletability graph, this is quite amazing to me. So the dashed lines represent the tablet target tensile strength of 2 megapascals. And if we look, we can see that the compression stress needed to reach a 2 megapascal tablet ranged from 25 megapascals to 130 megapascals. So a huge range, and this is all just by changing the spray drying conditions. And the SDD particle size for this case was 40 to 90, so the 10 micron that we made wasn't, the CTC profiles weren't performed of that one. And then again, we had the same bulk density range, which was 0.08 to 0.42 grams per cc. So tabletability is a nonlinear function of surface area for brittle SDDs. So what we did here was we plotted the SDD-specific surface area And we plotted it against compression stress for a 2 megapascal tensile strength compact. And here, what's not shown is some of the powder flow testing. So what the blue rectangle represents is the SDDs with the best powder flow, and what the green rectangle represents is SDDs with the best mechanical properties. So now here we can start to co-optimize the powder flow and the mechanical properties by looking where these two rectangles intersect. And it looks like there's 3 SDDs within that area. Okay. Now this slide shows so what we did was we took the DOE and we modeled the responses we modeled the factor to the responses, and we created these plots. And what we're trying to say here is that we can directly relate SDD mechanical properties back to spray drying parameters. So in the first plot, we have droplet size and outlet temperature, and the contour lines represent the compression stress needed to achieve a 2 megapascal tensile strength compact. And in the second plot, we have relative saturation, and this is a calculated value at the outlet of the spray dryer, and then spray dryer outlet temperature, which again is a calculated value. And we've related those again directly to the compression stress needed to achieve a 2 megapascal tensile strength tablet. So when we start making these models, we can start to really mathematically optimize this to a not only to a maximizing the mechanical properties and flow properties, but we can also check things like the derivative to understand if we're in a very robust space or not. And the last thing to say here is statistical models are pragmatic, but we also like to understand what's going on mechanistically. So in the following slides, what we've done is we've shown some cartoons of what we believe is going on. So this slide shows we've kind of divided this table into the original morphology of the particle, a description, and then we've separated the atomization and the thermodynamics. So the atomization is represented by droplet size, and the thermodynamics of the spray dryer is represented by drying rate. And so when we have a large droplet size and a very fast drying rate, we get a large blown up skinny particle with skinny walls, so thin-walled particle. When we have the same droplet size but we decrease the drying rate, we get a similar particle, although the wall thickness tends to be thicker. And then, as you would expect, when we decrease the droplet size but use a high fast drying rate, we get a small particle with thin wall. And then if we use a small droplet size and a very low or slow drying rate, we get a small thick-walled particle. And now if we relate these we can relate these morphologies to the mechanical properties. And so this is kind of our hypothesis on what's happening. So we run the DOE, we make our models, and then we try and have a fundamental understanding or a mechanistic understanding of what the empirical model is trying to tell us. And in this case, if we look at the large particle size and thin wall, what we can see is that the SDD bulk density is low, and the result of a compression to a 0.85 solid fraction is a bunch of very fractured particles. So the surface area before compression was low-medium, and then the surface area after compression is very high. Therefore, the tensile strength of a 0.85 solid fraction compact is very high. And then the opposite of that, a large particle with thick wall is going to have a high SDD bulk density, which we all know is better for powder flow, but the result compression to a 0.85 solid fraction is a still almost intact particle with a bunch of fractures, but not quite shattered apart like we see in the thin wall particles. And therefore, the surface area before compression is low, and the surface area after compression changes a little bit, but probably still low. And this is represents the smallest tensile strength at a 0.85 solid fraction compact. And then we go to a small particle size thin wall. And again, the SDD bulk density is going to be low, so we take a hit here on the powder flow. But the result of compression is again shattered particles similar to the large ones. And so the surface area before compression is high, and then after compression is extremely high. And this represents the compact with the highest tensile strength at a 0.85 solid fraction. And then finally, a small particle size and thick-walled is going to have a high bulk density, so good powder flow. Not quite as good as the large particle size thick-walled, but the surface area before compression is going to be low to medium, and after compression is still probably going to be low to medium. Now, I think one thing to realize is when we look at this, what we can do is we can start to optimize particles for flow, knowing that when we compress them, that we're going to be at a lot higher surface area. So if there is a dissolution rate effect, or if there is a tablet disintegration effect, understanding that surface area before compression and after compression changes is a really neat thing to optimize some of the SDD attributes. Okay, so our second case study, we're looking at a SDD that's primary mechanism of compaction is plastic deformation. Now, the goal of this study was to screen sensitivity of surface area, drug loading, and dispersion polymer to the mechanical properties of ketoconazole SDD. So ketoconazole was the model compound. And these SDDs were characterized by particle size, and surface area was characterized by BET. We then measured the CTC profiles for each of the SDDs and imaged the fracture compact. Now, the results indicated that the mechanical properties are dependent on drug loading, dispersion polymer, and surface area, but in a very different way than the previous case studies. And although they exhibit really favorable mechanical properties, they're generally not as tunable as the SDDs in the previous case studies that exhibited brittle fracture. Okay, so this slide shows some of the SDD characteristics. So it's particle size and its morphology. So we subcategorized into HPMCAS SDDs and PBPVA SDDs. And we spray dried what's shown here is 20% active and 80% active HPMCAS-M, and then 20 and 80% active PBPVA SDDs. And what we can see is through the morphology, we can see we have some that are hollow spheres, like we had seen before and described before, and others that are more raisin-like or collapsed spheres. And although it's not shown here, the BET measurements for the different surface area ones were about an order of magnitude different for the same formulation. So that is the 20% M formulation with the high surface area was an order of magnitude higher than the 20% active HPMCAS formulation with the low surface area. And the only difference there is how we atomized it and the drying conditions in the spray dryer. Okay, so this slide shows the tabletability and compactability of the HPMCAS SDDs, and they're plotted as a function of drug loading, or the different drug loadings are on the plot. And crystalline ketoconazole is represented by the green circle in these plots. Additionally, on the right-hand side, there are some SEM micrographs of the cross-section compacts to show the kind of the mechanism of the particle deformation. So in general, we can say that tabletability improves with drug loading, and this is indicated by the black arrows on the upper plot, which represent the compression stress needed to achieve a 2 megapascal tensile strength tablet. And really, this seems to be related to the malleability of the SDDs by inspection of the SEMs. So if we look at the 20% one, we can see that the particles are very deformed and have kind of plastically flowed together, whereas the 80% SDD drug-loaded ones, the particles look a little more elastic and really haven't flowed together to the extent that the 20% SDDs did. And this is further collaborated by the SDD yield pressures. Although we measured them, that they're not shown here, but the SDD yield pressures did increase with drug loading. And if we were to speculate what caused this, really, I think what we'd say is there's two things that cause this. One is the intrinsic material property. So obviously, one has a different ratio of drug and polymer, and when made amorphous and integrated into that material, they're going to have different properties. But I think the other one it has to do with morphology and wall thickness. So if we take two solutions, one with a different amount of polymer and drug, and because the solution properties are different, if we spray dry them at the same conditions, the resulting particles are going to have different properties, that is, different wall thicknesses. And because of this, and because they're hollow, that's going to cause a difference in how they deform. So I think one of the main points on this slide is that we don't necessarily need a high drug loading SDD if you get a big advantage from a big advantage in mechanical properties and you have good dissolution and disintegration, you can remove the majority of the filler in the tablet and then decrease the drug loading in the SDD. And that does a lot for you if the SDD is kinetically, if the physical stability of the SDD is kinetically trapped, it's generally more stable at a lower drug loading, and as we see here, the mechanical properties are better as well. Okay, so this slide shows the same thing as the previous slide, except for the PV-PVA SDDs. And in this case, we also see the tabletability improve with lower drug loading, but really there's a caveat. The formulations only diverge after about a solid fraction of 0.8. So if the target tensile strength for a tablet is 2 megapascal, one may infer that there is no impact of drug loading. However, if you're going to a much higher tensile strength, say for a mini tablet, this would be a pronounced difference. So although there is a difference, in reality, depends really on the target tensile strength of the tablet you're going for. And the SEMs confirm this, showing little signs of plastic deformation or brittle fracture in the SEM micrographs below. And one thing to note is in the 80% SDD at the highest compression pressure, which was 240 megapascals, we see that the compact actually doesn't even look like particles anymore. And really, we're not sure what's going on here, but I can tell you one thing, that's probably not good for dissolution rate. So if we go to the next slide, the next thing we investigated was the impact of SDD surface area. And in this case, as expected, increased surface area improves the mechanical properties. So the black arrows represent the improvement from low surface area to high surface area. And we did this with the 20% SDDs and the 80% SDDs. And now the SEM micrographs of the compact are all taken at the same magnification. So again, the difference in surface area is stark. However, if you look very close, and maybe take my word for it, the mechanism of deformation is qualitatively the same for the high and low surface area SDDs. Okay, and lastly, this slide shows the impact of surface area for PV/PVA SDDs. And unlike the HPMCS SDDs, there's arguably little to no gain in mechanical properties with increasing surface area. So for a 2 megapascal tensile strength tablet, there would be little difference in the compression stress. However, the compacts would be at different solid fractions, so there may be a different difference in dissolution. When we see something like this during development, what that's a key for us to do is it allows us to look at other things to optimize, like powder flow. So if the low surface area SDDs have the same dissolution or acceptable dissolution as the high surface area SDDs, we would select them because generally the lower surface area SDDs have a lot better powder flow properties. And these are some of the SEM micrographs of the cross-section compacts. And generally, when we look at the cross-section compacts, again the mechanism of compaction is similar at the lower pressures, and then at the higher pressures where they diverge, we start to see this plastic flow almost to the point where you aren't seeing particles anymore. Okay, so the next slide shows what we wanted to do was kind of give an overview of how we can engineer these SDD particles. And so what this slide shows is a way to measure a material's deformation characters. And what we plotted here was the immediate axial recovery of an SDD compact versus the cumulative axial recovery of the compact. And what we did was we did a bunch of excipients. So we have our avicils, which are in the plastic region. We have our lactose and dical, which are generally in the fracture region, and PV/PVA alone, which is in the plastic region, and HPMCAS alone, which is in the elastic region along with starch. And the blue diamonds, the blue hollow diamonds, represent the range of the ketoconazole HPMCAS SDDs, and the red hollow diamonds represent the PV/PVA ketoconazole SDDs. So what we can see here is by changing drug loading, by changing polymer, and by changing surface area, we can in effect change an SDD's mechanism of deformation all the way from fracture all the way up to elastic. So that's a very, very stark difference, and very cool to be able to do that. Okay, so in summary, the mechanical properties of spray-dried amorphous dispersions can be engineered. SDD particle size and density and morphology can be independently controlled. And the mechanical properties are usually co-optimized with bulk handling and constrained by dissolution and disintegration and physical state stability of the SDD. Now, dependent on the dispersion polymer, API, and spray drying conditions, SDDs can exhibit brittle fracture or plastic deformation as their primary mechanism of compaction. And brittle SDDs have mechanical properties that are highly tunable within the spray drying process, and this is due presumably to an increase in surface area upon compression. And plastic SDDs typically have less tunability because we're not really creating any new surface areas. We're just allowing those surface areas to plastically flow together. So they have typically less tunability than brittle SDDs, but nevertheless can be tuned as well. But they also can be very sensitive to drug loading. So I thank you guys, thank everyone for listening, and at this point I'll turn it over to Rita.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Goodwin, for that informative presentation. This time we'll begin the Q&A portion of the webinar. So audience members can type questions in the widget located at the bottom of your presentation window. And here is our first question. Does the grade of HPMCAS in the SDD impact the mechanical properties?
Great question, and thank you so much, Rita. I think in our experience we've seen that the grade of HPMCAS may impact the mechanical properties a little bit, but we haven't seen a big difference, and so we haven't seen a big difference in the mechanical properties there. What we would speculate, I think, is that if there was big differences in the molecular weight rather than just the degree of substitution in the different HPMCAS grades, that would probably cause a big difference, whereas just the degree of changing the degree of substitution it may cause a difference, but probably the difference will be very small and maybe not picked up by the tests we use.
Okay, thank you. Here's the next question. In your experience, do high-loaded SDD tablets have significant strain rate dependent mechanical properties?
Oh, great question. Thank you so much, Rita. So in our experience, when we have an SDD whose predominantly mechanism of compaction is dominated by plastic deformation, we do see strain rate dependencies. And then the opposite, SDDs that exhibit mostly brittle fracture, we see less of a strain rate dependence. And so at an early stage, what we try and do is when we identify the primary mechanism of compaction, we try and get a good assessment of a strain rate dependence by changing our speeds at which we compress at, and then using that to regress to what a press would be running at or a high-speed press would be running at commercial speeds.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Does changing the SDD surface area impact physical stability?
Okay, thank you. Great question. And this is a complex question. So the first thing I think we need to talk about is whether the SDD is kinetically stabilized or thermodynamically stabilized, and whether the starting material is surface enriched. So if we assume that the starting material is not surface enriched and we have a kinetically trapped SDD, we tend to see crystallization first on the SDD surface in most cases, but it's not clear whether the onset of crystallization is caused by the increasing surface area. We may see, once crystallization starts, we may see faster crystallization. But again, this is if the starting material is truly the same. So just summing that up, larger surface area does not lead to a decrease in physical stability if the material is truly the same.
Well, thank you. Here's our next question. Does changing the SDD particle size and density impact the dissolution rate?
So this is a great question, and thank you. So in a short answer, yes, it can. So changing the SDD particle size and density will most definitely change the surface area of the SDD. Now, I think in our experience, what we've seen is that SDDs exhibit several different dissolution or disintegration mechanisms. If the mechanism is an erodible-based mechanism where the particle is dissolving by erosion, then that will change dissolution rate. And if dissolution rate is one of the limiting factors for absorption, then this may have to be, when the surface area may have to be engineered, the dissolution of the SDD has to be taken into consideration when changing the surface area of the SDD when trying to optimize the mechanical properties.
Okay, great. Here's our next question. Which is the best method to test particle size without destroying brittle SDD products?
Okay, yeah, great question. So generally what we use is we use a Malvern masticizer, which is based on light scattering, and what we'll do is a pressure titration curve. And if it's very brittle, and I don't have too much expertise here, but if it's very brittle, I think sometimes we've used a wet method, and I think that's a little more gentle as opposed to a dispersive air method that can break the particles apart. And so there's that, and then I know other people have also used, there are instruments out there that will take photographs of the particles as opposed, and light scattering. So those two orthogonal methods, if you generally compare them, you will see if you're breaking particles or not.
All right, we have time for one more question. How is the bulk density related to the particle size and surface area for these cases?
Okay, so the bulk density so how does the bulk density relate to the particle size and the surface area? So the bulk density is, I'm sorry?
Yeah, I was just repeating the question for you.
Okay.
How is the bulk density? How is the bulk? Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. So the bulk density is kind of tuned independently of the particle size. And those are the two different handles we can use. So if we need big particles or small particles, or if we want thick-walled particles or not, those are the two independent kind of handles we use to change those independently. And we can change those independently to increase the surface area or decrease the surface area, or find a mix.
All right. Well, thank you for that answer. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I want to thank the audience for their interesting questions and participation in today's event, and thank our speaker, Aaron Goodwin. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, Capsugel Dosage Form Solutions, for making today's educational webcast possible. This webcast will be available for on-demand viewing through February of 2017. You'll receive an email from Pharmaceutical Technology alerting you when the webcast will be available for replay. Please invite your colleagues to view the on-demand version by forwarding them the announcement. Thank you for joining us today, and see you next time.